Hello and welcome to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. This podcast is all about our journey into the woods of ourselves, getting to know who we are, where we are, and where we're going in life so that we can create the life that we want to live. It's about deepening your connection with yourself, taking inspired action, and really trusting yourself and your intuition. It's also about mindset. Our beliefs are such an important part of this journey. And there are so many ways for us to change our mindset so that we can more easily live a life of expansive joy. This podcast is also about going literally into the woods and spending time in nature, and how that can help us on our own personal journey of self-knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now let's get into this week's episode. Hello, adventurers, and welcome to the Into the Woods podcast, episode 432. This is your host, Holly Wharton, and I'm back with another exciting guest. Today, I will be talking with Ben Reuter about movement and how movement is a lifestyle. I'm super excited to introduce this week's guest. He is an expert in movement, and he helps people to treat it as a lifestyle and to see it as a lifestyle rather than just one more thing to tick off your to-do list. Ben is an excellent guest with loads of great stories, and I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Now, movement is a big part of my life, but I'm not sure if I ever really thought about it until I had this conversation with Ben. Movement, whether it's walking or running or kickboxing, is a huge part of my mental, emotional, and physical well-being. It's not just exercise. It takes me places, it teaches me things, and it's made my life a better experience. So who is Ben Reuter? Ben Reuter, Ph.D, is an exercise physiologist teaching at a regional university. He is active as a practitioner, lifetime mover, and athlete who has delved into the world of podcasting with Move to Live and Fit Lab Pittsburgh. Ben believes that movement should be treated as a lifestyle, not just an activity, because movement is part of what makes life complete. The idea for the Moving to Live podcast came from his interest in listening to long-form movement-related podcasts that were directed towards either professionals or the general public. The idea for Fit Lab Pittsburgh podcast came during a run with his dogs when he realized that there were a variety of national fitness and movement-related podcasts, but none limited exclusively to Pittsburgh people, businesses, and activities. So what are you going to learn in this week's episode? We talk about what is movement and why is it so important? Why movement is a lifestyle and not an activity? Why movement is part of what makes life complete. How to shift your mindset so that you start to see movement as a lifestyle. And finally, Ben's top 3 tips for changing your perspective around movement. So without further ado, here is this week's episode. Hello, Ben. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Holly?
Good. I am super excited to talk with you about movement because you have a really great perspective that I haven't really thought about before, and I certainly haven't discussed on the podcast, so I'm really looking forward to this. So why don't we start out by having you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so if you look at my Twitter little limited bio, it says a practitioner or an exercise scientist straddling between academia and practical application. But what I am is my real job is I teach online for a local university or regional university, California University of Pennsylvania. And I teach exercise science. I have a doctorate in exercise physiology. And if you had told me 25 years ago or 30 years ago, I'm kind of old, that this is what I would be doing, I would kind of laugh at you because my original goal was I was going to end up somewhere out west, and I'm currently in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Ooh.
So I went to Gettysburg College, which is about 3.5 hours east of here. So I guess you could say I did make my way west, but not quite as far as I was initially intending. And about 4 years ago is when I started this whole thing that I think we're going to talk about. Movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity.
Yep. That's so interesting. My parents are both from Pittsburgh and ended up in California, so they did make it a bit further west.
Well, I made it south. I spent some time in Atlanta, Georgia. I spent some time in Lexington, Kentucky, in Florida, and in Auburn, Alabama. But then I circled back up here, and as you probably know, since your parents are from Pittsburgh, if you're not originally from Pittsburgh, people say, well, why are you here? And my response is job. And you usually get a strange look. And it's like, but don't you miss home? And to me, home has kind of been wherever you make it.
Yeah.
One of the things, I've been here 14 years, And this is the longest by far any place I've ever lived because my parents always moved where there were jobs and I always moved. So it's kind of like where you end up, you can make your home.
Yep, I love that. That's exactly my life. I had a very stable kind of early years, but once I graduated from high school and went to college, I was all over the place. And until I found where I am today, where I've been for 10 years, I didn't live in the same place for more than a year. Like I was constantly moving. So very similar. So how do you like to move? Do you like to get outdoors? Like what's your favorite kind of movement adventure?
My favorite movement adventure is outdoors, number one.
Good.
In the woods, number two.
Yay.
Either on a mountain bike or with my two dogs that I put on a leash around my waist, which gives me the benefit of they help me go uphill.
Yeah.
I keep them in control on the flats and sometimes air quotes. I know we're just doing audio. They help me on the downhill. And I can say there have been times where I have slid down on my butt and they've kind of looked down and go, "What are you doing down here?"
Oh.
The only other thing I would add with that is preferably hills. So in addition to being in the woods with the dogs or on a mountain bike, I would like there to be some sort of hill, preferably going uphill.
Sounds like my kind of adventure. So we are here today to talk about movement, but let's start out by defining that term. So what is movement? How do you define it?
I define movement a little bit differently than what people think about when they talk about, well, I need to be more active.
Yeah.
So if we look at the end of the spectrum that we all know what we should do, we all know we should do some sort of resistance training. We all know we should do some sort of cardiovascular training. And as we get older, some of us realize, okay, we probably need to do some sort of mobility training, whether it's stretching, whether it's yoga, fill in your favorite activity. And there are various professional organizations all the way from the World Health Organization down to local and regional that tell us, 3 to 5 times a week for the cardiovascular, 2 to 3 times for the resistance training. And yet the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of people in the first world, people who have white collar jobs, et cetera, we don't meet that. If you're living someplace where you grow up on a farm, you don't have a choice of whether or not you're going to move. The cows don't feed themselves. Whatever it is, you are moving every day. But as we become more organized, and again, I'm using air quotes jokingly, civilized or white collar, the idea of moving and being active, you kind of lose it. Kind of like if you have kids or you have friends with kids, the 5 or 6 year old, sometime you're like, God, I wish this kid would just stop moving around. Well, now you hit whatever your age is and you stop moving. So I define movement different than the workout. Movement is just making a conscious choice to move. So you and I are making a conscious choice to be active, not looking at it or considering it's a workout.
Yes.
Some of your movement may be a workout, but at the end of the day, if you're moving more than you're not moving, the benefits far outweigh somebody who says, well, I sit at a desk all day, or I sit in my car or my truck all day, and 3 times a week for an hour I go to the gym, and 2 times a week for an hour I walk with my dog. It would be much better if throughout the day you intersperse things and you get to the end of the week and you're like, wow, look how many hours I moved. Not saying necessarily I have to move this much, but just making a conscious choice. What am I doing and how does it make me feel and how can I move more? So you and I were chatting before we started recording. I'm at a standing desk on a wobble board. So this is a conscious choice. I mentioned I teach in academia. I do a fair amount of writing, and because I teach online, I'm on a computer a lot. So I can tell you when I get concentrating on a computer, I'm the person who's slumped over the desk, hunched, and before you know it, 3 or 4 hours have passed and I've been locked in one position. And I've tried those various timers that you can get for computers where it pops up every 15 minutes and says you need to move. And what I realized when I really got concentrating, that would pop up and I just hit the escape button and keep going. So about 4 years ago, I picked up a standing desk, one that you can move up and down, that you sit on your regular desk. And it's like, well, I'll have it up some of the time and stand, and I'll have it down some of the time and I'll sit. And I've never had it down. And I've kind of progressed to that to now I stand on a wobble board, specifically a Pona Ono board, which has air-filled bulbs on all 4 corners so I can wobble around. But what it does is it gives me more movement or more fidgeting. And I find it when I get uncomfortable standing, that's the time for me to take a break, to maybe take a walk, to maybe do a little stretching, to maybe go downstairs and get a cup of coffee. And then about 6 months ago, I progressed it even further. For your listeners who have been to places where maybe you go off in the woods and there's a stream and you take off your shoes and socks and you end up walking through small rocks or acupressure on your feet, I actually am now standing on a wobble board with an acupressure pad on top of that, barefoot. On the one hand, you could say, wow, he's really extreme. On the other hand, you could say, boy, that's really smart. I like to say I'm a gadget freak. So if somebody is going to ask me about something, or I become aware of something and I can rationalize it's somewhat related to my profession, then I'm probably going to try it and expose me to all kinds of tools, toys, and things that are lots of fun, like standing on a wobble board, which is a lot more fun than just slumped in a chair.
See, that's so interesting. Like, I've always been so resistant to the standing desks because 1,000 years ago when I was in high school and college, I had like a summer job, as a cashier at a home improvement store, and we weren't allowed to sit down. We weren't allowed to have stools, so we had to stand. And my feet would kill me by the end of the day, and my back would hurt. And I was like 20 years old at the time, and it was like, how is this so difficult? So I've always been resistant to the standing desk because I think it's going to be like that cashier job, except I'm on a computer instead of a cash register. So how is it that, obviously it's different if you're on a wobble board, but like, how is it that standing desks aren't just as bad as sitting desks, but different?
I think they can be because too much in the movement field, too much in anything, it's either do this or do that. There's no continuum. And I think when you talk about movement, when you talk about standing desks, when you talk about anything else, there's a continuum. It's not a good, bad. It's what am I doing now? Are there things that are worth my while or that might make it better? So one of the things that I think is especially cool, I taught for a while at a college in Florida way back in the late 1990s, 2000s. And I didn't like sitting at a desk. When I was in graduate school, I actually found an old sofa that somebody's mother had, and it had the plastic on it. So this was a lime green sofa that was probably 7.5 feet long. It was really, it looked like crap, but it was like brand new, think 1965, plopped into my office at Auburn University. And I used to grade papers, and I used to put my laptop on my lap and type lying down because it was more comfortable than sitting in a crappy desk.
Yeah.
So then I got my first job out of graduate school. I was like, well, I don't want to sit in one of these crappy chairs. So I got a Swiss ball and I tried a Swiss ball and I found I could slump on a Swiss ball. So the same things that I mentioned a few minutes ago, I could do that on a Swiss ball. So then it's like, well, I'm going to get one of those kneeling chairs, which you've probably seen, where you sit on your butt and you put your knees there.
Yeah. And you're straight.
And pretty soon what I found what I would do with that after I worked with a while, when you rest on your knees or you rest on your shins and you hold your knees in one position where you're not moving your knee joint, is my knees got a little bit stiff.
Oh.
So what I would do is I would prop my butt on where your butt normally was, and I would put my feet where the knees were, and then I'd kind of go into that crouch position and I'd type like that.
Ooh.
So I knew that wasn't going to work very well either. But the Swiss ball worked fairly well, and it enabled me to, when I found myself slumping, I could stand up. And I knew that maybe other people sometimes listen to me. When one of my students graduated, went to grad school, got his first job, and posts on Facebook a picture of him at his desk and said, well, ever since you had this, Dr. Reuter, I wanted to have one, and now I have it. So I think probably what I was doing then is different than what I do now. What I'm doing now is different what I do 5 years from now.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that you need to look at is what am I doing now, and do I feel bad, or does it make me feel uncomfortable? So if you sit somewhere and you're not comfortable, then the first thing you need to do is ask yourself, well, what's the chair like? Does it fit me? Because, most of us are not going to go out and buy a $1,500 Arian chair, Herman Miller Arian chair, which if you've ever looked at them, they come in various sizes.
Yep.
We're not going to do that. We're going to go to our local office supply store or whatever in our office. And if you have to be somebody who is unusually tall or unusually short, that chair might not fit you. And this may be why chairs never really seem to fit me, because I'm 6'1", but my pants inseam is 30 or 31 inches. So I have short legs and a long torso.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you're a average size woman and you try to sit in an office chair with the arms, you're probably going to find your shoulders are shrugged up like that. So the first thing you want to think about is, what can I do ergonomically that maybe doesn't cost me a whole lot of money, or I can experiment with? So one of the things you could do, for example, with the chair, if you're shorter or have shorter legs, you could find a couple of books to put your feet on to see if that makes it more comfortable. Because I don't know how tall you are, but I've got friends who are like 5 foot. And if they try to sit in a chair, a lot of times their feet are hanging and that gets very uncomfortable. If you're not sure about a standing desk, and actually this is what my dad did to experiment with it, you can manipulate with a cardboard box and books and your laptop and figure out, oh, does this work? And then the other thing is realize is nothing's forever. If you get a standing desk, you can use it some of the time. And that was my whole anticipation. And then just for me, it's like, oh, this is good. When I get uncomfortable, it's a sign to take a work break.
Yeah.
So I think the big take home message is don't be afraid to experiment, because it might be better, it might be worse, but you're experimenting and figuring out what's good for you. And then when you find something that works, you might be able to build on that.
Yeah. And you have more information. So tell me about the wobble board. What does that give you? Does that help with your balance and other activities? What have you gotten out of the wobble board?
Well, I was actually flashing back when you were commenting about your job and standing on your feet. So I have hardwood floors.
Yeah.
So, of course, I get the standing desk. And first thing you realize is if you stand on hardwood floors, it's hard. And I'm somebody who, and we may get into this more, I've experimented with different types of shoes. I've gone from wearing orthotics to not having to wear orthotics because I've managed to figure out how to strengthen things and make things move better. So I don't wear shoes a whole lot when I'm in the house. And I realized that standing on a hardwood floor was pretty uncomfortable. So my original degree was in athletic training. I'm a certified athletic trainer. So I was familiar with wobble boards for rehabilitation. And I'd always had wobble boards when I worked in athletic training. And about the same time that I was experimenting with standing desk was about the same time that I had the good fortune, being semi-sarcastic there, of herniating a disc for the second time. And one of the things that I realized with that is most of my activities by choice, as I've described, are straight ahead activities. And my balance sucked and my side to side motion sucked. So I started doing more of that to incorporate that as part of my rehabilitation. So I had one of these wobble boards. It's like, well, I stand on it. There's no reason I can't stand on it and work on my computer. And it was pretty good. And at the time, part of this rethinking of movement for me, thinking of movement as a lifestyle and not just an activity, came from one of my dogs who unfortunately I've since lost. About the same time that all this happened, I had an experience with a retinal problem with my eye where I had 9 surgeries and 15 surgical procedures over the course of 3+ years, and moving, which I took for granted, sometimes I couldn't do because holding a position with that. And at the same time, this Labrador who was 4 years old developed idiopathic epilepsy. And I asked the neurologist for my dog, yes, my dog had a neurologist, what can she do? And she said, she can do whatever she wants to do. You're going to know, she's going to tell you. And she liked to do what I did. She didn't like to ride a bike, but she liked to be in the woods. She liked to walk. And then she liked to hang out with me when I was working on my computer. So I introduced the wobble board. And the first thing I do is I look down and I realize that she's laying at my feet and I'm going to nail either her paws or her nose as the wobble board wobbles back and forth. So I start looking around, Amazon is your friend, Google is your friend. And I came up with this other one with air orbs. So it wobbles and it bounces around, but there's a little space. So she had space for her nose and paws to get. Or one of the things that's really cool is I actually have a picture my girlfriend took of me on my computer on my standing desk with the dog with her paws and her nose resting on my feet as I type away at the computer.
Oh, it's so cute. So tell us a little bit about the concept that movement is a lifestyle, not an activity. We've touched on that, but I really want to dig deeper into that because I think, like you said, like so many of us, are told that like you have to get exercise. Exercise is important. And so many people hate exercise, just exercise for the purpose of exercise. So what is this? Movement is a lifestyle, not an activity. What does that mean?
Rather long story, but I'll try to break it into 2 parts that I think will clarify it is. The first thing is I'm one of those people who grew up in the country. I was always active. My joke, and anybody who has heard me talk before has heard me say this, I was fortunate enough to be able to play 3 sports in high school because I went to a very small high school. And the story behind that was I grew up on a farm and my dad said when I was in 9th grade, well, you can play 1 sport, but I'm going to need your help for the rest of the time. And it's like, okay, well, soccer's in the fall, so I want to play soccer. And about halfway through the year, he goes, well, you should really support your teammates and you should support the school. You should play basketball too. So I played basketball. And then about halfway through basketball, the same thing came for baseball. And the benefit of growing up in the country working on a farm, going to a small school and playing all three sports is I didn't have to be good. And I wasn't good. So I went to college, and I tell people my college athletic experience or official athletic experience was I was a 2-year junior varsity soccer player at a Division III school. I wasn't very good, but I had the opportunity to try. And what all of this set me up for is I just enjoyed moving. It wasn't unusual for me in college to play pickup basketball, to run. And I got out of college and I got into ultra distance triathlons and running, and it was fun. And I continued to run. I continued to bike. And as I mentioned, I took it for granted. This is just the normal. I've got friends that I met 20 years ago that we'll meet up. We live all over the country. And it was 3 or 4 years ago, I was speaking at a conference. I had not seen one of them in 20 years. And he happened to be stationed at the Pentagon, and the conference is in Washington, D.C. He says, "Hey, I'm running at 5:30 in the morning. You want to join me? We can catch up." And it was literally, I kept in touch with him by phone, by email, by Facebook, et cetera. But we hadn't seen each other face to face in 20 years. And it was literally, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" And we set out exactly what we had done 20 years ago. A couple of years ago, similarly with a friend of mine who had retired to Colorado, I visited him and his wife. And over the course of 5 or 6 days, we did 20 plus hours of biking, hiking, and running. Not because we wanted to move, but that's how we'd met each other. And that was just our lifestyle. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I had the dog that developed epilepsy, and at the same time I had some retinal injuries, where these are things I took for granted. And suddenly, I'd be negotiating with my eye surgeon. He'd say, "Well, you can walk, but I don't want you to run because of the jarring, and you can ride your road bike, but I don't want you to go mountain biking because of the jarring. Or if you would really stay off the bike, I'd feel safer." And kind of jumping back just for a second before I jump forward and bring this all home, when I went to my doctoral program, I was a non-traditional doctoral student. I had worked for 4 years before. A gentleman who was a mentor of mine, who did not find this out until later, told my major professor in doctoral studies, "Hey, if Ben's ever a jerk, send him out for a run because he's a lot easier to deal with when he's got his workout in." And what I realized when I was not able to move as much as I normally did during the recovery from the various eye procedures is my sweet spot was 40 to 60 minutes of movement most days of the week. It didn't really matter what the movement was, although preferentially it's what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, outside in the woods climbing. I just needed to do something. And as I saw that that's what made me feel better physically, psychologically, all of my good ideas come from when I'm doing something outdoors without earphones on, just free associating, or just something will pop into my mind. I realized that even though I enjoyed, air quotes, working out, doing the resistance training, going for a run with a set goal, what I really enjoyed and what the most important thing for me was just moving, doing some sort of movement. And I think part of that was me with the eye injury. Part of that was just seeing that my dog, just the idea, here's a dog who had idiopathic epilepsy, who by the time I had to put her down was on 8 different medications. Thank God for pet insurance. But, the great thing is she was able to take walks in the woods literally up until the day I had to put her down, and just see how much enjoyment and fun she got out of that, and realizing it's like, this is what I enjoy and what I enjoy doing. And my girlfriend and I kind of came up with the idea, I'd like to start a podcast about this. We do a couple, but the main one that really focuses here in Pittsburgh, called Fitness Lab Pittsburgh or Fit Lab Pittsburgh, where the ethos of it is movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. And we do the podcast, but we also 3 times a week, we've been doing this since I think 2017 on social media. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, there's a 1-minute movement tip lifestyle hack video, not a workout per se, but just kind of a simple 1 minute. One of the most popular ones was, contrary to popular belief, you don't wear underwear with bike shorts.
Oh, interesting.
Just something like that. Or the most recent one, the one that's coming out tomorrow, hasn't come out yet, although it'll come out by the time this airs, is 4 words. Use them as a hashtag or take them just as their meaning. Be safe, be smart. When you're out walking, running, biking, being active, be aware that even though a car is supposed to stop, it might not stop. So err on the side of caution. Make sure that you assume it's not going to stop. And if it doesn't stop, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. Just these little things to remind people that there's so much of a tendency to take so many things so seriously and so strictly and say, well, I was scheduled to go out for a 5-mile walk today and I don't have time to do a 5-mile walk. So forget it. I'm not going to do anything. Yeah. Work within what you have, because we have stress in our life. We have good stress and bad stress. And movement should be something that we look forward to. Movement should be something that when we're able to do it, it's a good stress. Not something that, okay, I just worked 8 hours. I just got off a plane flight the day before. My husband or wife is yelling at me. I just rushed to pick my kids up to school. Now I got to run out and I've got to get my 3-mile walk in. It's like, that's the sort of thing that what I think people tend to forget about is we have all kinds of stresses in our life, good stress and bad stress. And what happens is we have to be able to manage that stress. You see all these things on social media. Well, you need to eliminate stress or you need to control your stress. It's not about doing that. It's about managing it. It's about knowing what is it that sets you off or gives you the bad stress? What is it that sets you off or gives you the good stress? And understanding that, number one, and number two, taking steps. So I know, for example, if I don't get in the woods for 40 to 60 minutes most days of the week, I'm going to feel a lot worse. I'm not going to think as well. I'm going to be more of a grouch. So that's something that I've done in my life to say most days of the week, I'm going to do this. If I go to a conference, I may not be able to get to the woods, but I can pretty much guarantee, like I went to a conference this summer, first time in a long time because of COVID. And I had the joy of being in Florida in the middle of July.
Ooh.
Yes. And it's 5:30 in the morning. I was out for walking, jogging for 30 to 40 minutes before I went to the conference. And it wasn't as enjoyable as being in the woods, but it was better than doing nothing. And the other thing that I find with taking movement as a lifestyle is if you take away the fact that, okay, I have to do this. You may work out and do these certain activities. But when you're doing movement for the sake of movement, treating it as a lifestyle, take the headphones off, put the phone in the pocket, look around. I was out with my dogs a couple of years ago, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get my phone out of my top pocket, but I didn't have headphones on. I wasn't looking at my computer screen, and I actually got to see a couple of deer swimming across a stream and shaking themselves off and getting it on video. I wouldn't have got that if I was hardcore. I'm going to do this pace for this amount of time. So I think to kind of bring it all home, if you treat movement as a lifestyle and not just an activity, you try to find things that you enjoy doing. You may not enjoy running or biking, but you may enjoy gardening, or you may enjoy, like when I lived in Florida, my next door neighbor loved to work on his yard.
Yeah.
I don't like that. Maybe that's because I did landscaping. But, there'd be 5 or 6 hours every Saturday, every Sunday. My neighbor would be out working on his lawn. And whatever you're doing movement related, even if it's just walking, or if you go to and you walk around the city that you live in, that's vastly better than just sitting or being inactive. I think when you say movement is a lifestyle, think of it as what can I do to make movement the norm and not the abnorm, not just for me, but for my kids, for my friends, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think about the ways that I like to move, I run, I love running. I walk, love walking. I do kickboxing when my shoulder isn't injured, but they're movements that give me something. I'm not doing them for exercise so much as when I'm walking or running, like I'm going on trails, I'm seeing things, I'm seeing trees and I'm seeing animals and I'm seeing plants. I'm going places, and it gives me so much more than just being exercise.
You hit on something there, whether you realize or not, that is essential. You just mentioned 3 different things. You said, and I can kickbox when my shoulder allows me. Yeah. I think when we talk about working out or we talk about going to the gym, too often it's, I do yoga or I do high intensity interval training or I do this or I do that. And then if something prevents you from doing it, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's an injury, then it's like, I can't do what I want to do. But if you have a toolbox, so to speak, then I can't go to kickboxing because my shoulder bothers me, but I can go for a walk or I can go for a run. I think it also makes you much more open to trying new things. I've mentioned this before on other podcasts. One of the people that we interviewed for FitLab Pittsburgh, and I'm horrible with names, but he has a marketing company for pogo sticks. So if you've ever watched a basketball game where you see at halftime there are guys or women who come out and do tricks with pogo sticks, he has the marketing company for professional pogo stickers. And I think somebody will call and say, I want. And anyways, they have these pogo sticks that you pump up with a bicycle air pump.
Huh.
And I saw this written up probably 5 or 6 years ago in a Wall Street Journal. There was a cardiologist who was diagnosed with decreasing bone mass, and he was a big researcher, et cetera. He's like, I'm not going to go to the gym. I don't have time. And he figured out he got a pogo stick and he bounces 5 or 10 minutes a couple times a day on this pogo stick for weight bearing exercise.
Wow.
And I remember 4 or 5 years ago seeing this and going, that's really cool. Never really did anything about it. And then one of the things I commonly say, the great thing about social media is there's so much information. The bad thing about social media is there's so much information.
Yeah.
But I was just flipping through, looking at things a couple of years ago, and up pops this pogo stick marketing company that's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
Contact the guy. We go and interview him. We walk in and they've got these pogo sticks. And I'm like a little kid in a candy store. I'm a 50-year-old guy. It's like, can I try that? It's like, sure. It's like 2 bounces. And I had a pogo stick as a kid. It's like 2 bounces. Like, I want one of these. So I have a pogo stick, and periodically I'll take it back into my patio and I'll bounce up and down for 5 or 10 minutes. And it's different. It's fun. I found it's rhythmic. I mean, I think what you hit on when you said, well, I kickbox, I run, I walk. It's like, it's a new activity. And I don't think that if I just said, well, I'm a runner or I'm a one thing, that I'd be able to say, can I try that? And I'll admit the first time it was like I'd bounce once. It's like, okay, can I bounce twice?
Because it does require skill and it requires balance. So
it requires skill, it requires balance. And it's amazing when you do the wide variety of things. I mentioned one of the things that got me into treating movement as a lifestyle is the fact that I herniated a disc and realized I wasn't moving as well doing side-to-side motions. Now I'm out with the dogs, and if we come to a guardrail or a tree, I'm going to walk across that because it's fun.
Yeah.
Does it really accomplish anything per se as far as, oh, I got this more points for whatever the tracking device? No, but it's a whole lot of fun. And I think when you start to treat movement as a lifestyle, you're more likely to take up fun things or do things. Occasionally when I go with my girlfriend to the park, we've actually bought a Nerf football. We'll walk the dogs and we'll throw a Nerf football.
Fun. Yeah, it's making movement into play as well.
It is. I mean, everything is so serious. I mean, one of the things with my rehab that I did is I wanted to improve my balance. So I wanted a balance beam. Well, I'm not going to buy a gymnastics balance beam. And this is where the internet is good. I saw that various places said that you can make a balance beam out of a piece of PVC pipe. So I go to the local Home Depot and I start pulling out 8-foot lengths of PVC pipe and walking across them to find out which is the right diameter PVC pipe. By the way, it's 4 inches.
Okay, good to know.
Because it's strong enough and it's tall. And, initially my girlfriend's like, she goes, don't do this. People are going to look at you. And the amazing thing is I'm doing this. I'm experimenting. She's trying to climb into the shelves and hide. And people are pushing the carts back and forth. And they're not even looking at me. They don't care. So I think one of the things that makes people so resistant to moving or exercising or working out is like, oh my God, people are going to look at me. Essentially, no, they're not. Most of us are so self-engrossed in what we're doing. We're not going to look at you if you're standing on your head in the gym or you're standing on your head in the middle of the trail.
Or best case scenario, they're going to ask you about it and they'll be inspired to do it too.
Yes. And I mean, the neat thing for me, this has been the neatest thing for me with Fitness Lab Pittsburgh and the treating movement as a lifestyle. There have been 2 occasions over the years where I've been running with my dogs and people have come up to me because a lot of our movement tip lifestyle hack videos happen outdoors with our dogs. They've come up to me and said, those are the Fit Lab Pittsburgh Labradors.
Oh.
So they don't know who I am, but they recognize the Labradors because the Labradors are cavorting around. And to me, it's like, that's the cool thing. So I think when you treat movement as a lifestyle, it's like, don't take yourself seriously. Have fun with it.
Yeah. So why do you say that movement is part of what makes life complete? I find that a really interesting statement, and I love it.
One of my professors in my doctoral committee, I used to run with him, and he would be Dr. So-and-so in the classroom and Pete on the run. I remember him talking. He said, this is not backed in research, et cetera. This is just 2 academics talking. He said, one of the things I wish physicians would do is when somebody comes to them with depression, before they start saying, take this drug, take that drug, tell them to go for a run or go for a walk because of the natural endorphin release. And again, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a mental health professional. I know personally when I'm active, when I move, I'm more cheerful. I know intellectually when I herniated a disc in 2017, intellectually with my training, I knew, okay, this is going to take 6 to 10 weeks before it resolves and I gradually get better. Emotionally, when you wake up in the morning and it's 65 degrees and sunny out, it's like, boy, this would be a great day I can't go for a bike ride. So you have the intellectual and you have the emotional. And I knew the movement helped. I think it also helps with thought processes. I know I've talked to a couple of people I've interviewed for our other podcast, Moving to Live, They mentioned that a friend of mine who's career Navy, he said very often he'll go for a run with his second in command early in the morning and they'll talk about the problems that they're having and come up with solutions.
Mm.
I know that there's a physician, Dr. Gary Chimes, who when he was at the University of Pittsburgh in charge of rehab medicine, the fellowship program, he would talk to his students about taking patients for walks. Because I think one of the things, and I know Dr. Justin Berthold, who's here in Pittsburgh, he's the one who told me about this. He said, if he can, he'll take his patients for a walk around the block.
Wow.
And they'll talk. He's in a small specialty practice, so he can do that. But if you think about it, anybody who knows anything about going to see the doctor is that white coat pressure. Yeah. Or if you go in, like if you've ever been called into the principal's office, the boss's office or something, even if it's a good thing, there's an intimidation factor. Yeah. And just if you've got kids or friends and you have to have a serious conversation, it's a lot easier if rather than you and I are like 6 feet apart staring at each other across a desk, if we're walking and casually talking. So I think that's part of what makes movement a lifestyle. I think the other thing is if you talk to people as they get older, or you have family members as they get older, you can clearly see the differences in the quality of life, the ability to do things between people who have made the choice or the commitment to staying active throughout their lifetime versus people who don't. I tell 2 stories on this, and I think this really brings it home for the importance. When my parents were first married, they knew a lady, and this was in the late 1950s, they knew a lady who was in her 80s through their church who fell and broke her hip. And at that point in time, when you broke your hip at that age, I said, well, you don't have that much longer to live. Yeah. We'll put you in bed. She lived to be over 100, no dementia.
Wow. And what was the difference? She stayed active or?
No, but they didn't repair her hip, but she was stuck in bed. So Not a very good quality of life. On the other hand, I remember when I was teaching basic college health class in Florida, there was a gentleman in his early 80s who went out on the Pinellas Trail on a holiday. He was an active gentleman and had a massive stroke and died when he hit the ground. Oof. And I would tell these 2 stories to the high school or to college students, 18, 19 years old. And with the gentleman who fell and died of a stroke, I'd say, that's phenomenal. Isn't that wonderful? And they'd look at me like I was this ghoul. But I'm a name dropper, not because I want to show how many people I know, but because I want your listeners to start searching the internet. So these are good sources. A good friend of mine who I've interviewed a couple times, Don Moxley, Don has the comment. Don says, you don't want to look about lifespan. You want to look at live span.
Yeah.
Lifespan is how long do you live. Live span is how well do you live.
Yeah.
And just kind of to bring this home, a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, one of my clients, retired high-powered businessman, saw him for personal training, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And I remember talking to him, and he said, this is going to kill me. I know it's going to kill me. I'm going to fight it. I'm going to do everything I can. And he continued to come to personal training. Sometimes we just do breathing exercises when he come literally the day of chemotherapy. But 2 things that really brought home, and this was a gentleman who'd made the decision all of his life, even as a high-powered businessman, to be active, not to work out, but to be active and to make it a choice, even though some of his activity was workouts. But one of the things he said when he was diagnosed to me, he'd gone every year to a ski area out west. He'd gone 30-some years, the first week in December, just him, and spent a week skiing alone. Like you and I go into the woods and that centers us. That was his yearly centering. Am I doing what I want to do? And I have a picture that he sent me the year after he was diagnosed with cancer of him at the top of the mountain, looking down the mountain, and nobody's on the mountain. He was able to do that.
Lovely.
The other thing is, unfortunately, because of all the side effects of the chemo and the progression of the disease, he ended up in hospice. There is a video that his wife was able to take of him the day before he had a massive stroke and died, of him using his week-old granddaughter's stroller as a walker, pushing her down the hospice hallway. And I remember when she showed it to me, my first thought was not, oh, that's terrible, he's no longer with us. My first thought was 10 years from now, this girl is going to have the opportunity to say, look at Grandpa. Grandpa was literally the day before he died moving. And I think that's somebody he exemplified. He maximized his life, or he had a quality of living, not necessarily as long a lifespan as most of us would want to have. So I think too often we forget what you're doing now, the decision to, hey, I'm going to take a walk after dinner rather than plopping down in front of the television set for 40 minutes. It's little increments, little things. It makes us stronger. It makes us more resilient. So then when maybe something happens that's a negative stressor, we're better able to withstand it and, for lack of a better term, fight it off and come out on the other side.
Yeah, it's an investment in your future.
Yes, and that's the argument I use every time I try to convince myself I need another bicycle or another piece of fitness. Well, it's an investment in my future and it's cheaper than a night in the hospital.
That's true. That's definitely true. So how can people shift their mindset so they can start to see movement as a lifestyle rather than this crappy exercise thing we have to do?
I would say 2 or 3 things I would suggest. First of all, be an N of 1. And this came to me from my eye surgeon about, am I allowed to swear on here?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I had numerous eye surgeries. One time, and none of these were due to surgical problems. I had an eye that was extremely nearsighted, and it basically turned into a physics problem because the retina was weak in multiple areas. And I remember seeing the doctor the day after surgery, him looking at it saying, yeah, everything's good. This should be good. You should be good going forward. I know it's been hard. And literally that night it tore in a new place.
Oh.
The next day I walk in, and, I did not know him that well then. This was early in the process. He goes, fuck, Ben, tell me no. And that same day, this was somebody, he probably spent 40 minutes in it. He said, look, this is what I told you yesterday. That's what the normal is. That's what the standard. He said, you have to remember everybody is an N of 1. So this is generally what we're looking at, but you may be the outlier. That doesn't mean we can't fix this. And knock on wood, we've been pretty stable. So I think when you start saying, how do you change your outset from looking at it from, I got to work out 3 times a week, I can't wait till I go on vacation so then I don't have to work out, to I like to move, boy, let's go on this vacation where maybe there's this really neat hike we can go on, is the first thing you have to say is like, look, it doesn't matter what Holly's doing. It doesn't matter what I'm seeing on social media. And that's one of the horrible things about social media. I will be the first to admit I sometimes get on social media just to laugh at the ridiculousness. Because let me hold a dumbbell. Let me stand on a Swiss ball. Let me put the Swiss ball on a wobble board. Let me hold a kettlebell in the other hand, and then I can do a squat. And on the one hand, some of your listeners will say, well, he's exaggerating. On the other hand, I suspect if you search around on Instagram or Facebook for a couple minutes, you can probably find that.
Yeah.
So I think, first of all, treat yourself as an N of 1. Yep. Realize what you're doing or not doing is an investment in your future.
Yep.
Number 2, think about things that you enjoy doing. Think about things that even if other people weren't going to do it, you'd still do it. So some people, that does involve going to gyms. That does involve fitness classes. I know people who absolutely love going to yoga classes. For me, the best thing I can say about a yoga class is what somebody interviewed said. It's like, I went to a yoga class once. It was enough. It's not for me.
Yeah,
it
not
doesn't
for me
mean
either.
that it doesn't mean it's not good.
Yeah.
So too often for those of us who are in the health, the wellness, the fitness, whatever you want to call it, I call it the movement field. Too often we say, Holly, you should be doing this. And if you're not doing this, then, well, I don't know, bad things are going to happen. Rather than saying, boy, I'd really like to see you do this, Holly. But if you're moving, that's like 50% of the way there. Then if you hurt your shoulder, then I can say, Holly, if you want to do that kickboxing more, maybe we can give you some exercises that if you don't want to go to the gym, we can get you a couple of weights at home and some other things, and we can strengthen up that shoulder so you can do it. So number 1, you're an N of 1. Number 2, pick things or find things, multiple, like you've done, that you can do, that you enjoy doing. Number 3, pick things that you can do in a variety of locales. So I think one of the things, you can't have an interview without talking about what's gone on over the past 18 months or so with COVID. At least here in the U.S., when gyms shut down, there were so many people said, oh my God, I don't know what to do. And my twofold thought was, number 1, it's like, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. I was reminded of when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I suspect you were probably the same way. It was, I'm bored, Mom. I'm bored, Dad. And they say, get out of the house, go play in the yard, and don't come back for 2 hours.
Yes.
Semi-sarcastic with this, semi-serious. But, we can put a man on the moon. We can replace somebody's heart. I think people should be able to figure out how to move on a regular basis. But clearly, we have failed. And when I say we, those of us in the movement field, and that's one of the reasons I do this thing, because I can teach you how to do resistance training, how to do exercise classes, how to get your heart rate up. I have a limited number of people who can do that. If I get more and more people to say, hey, movement is a lifestyle. Boy, I feel better than I move. Gee, I'd really like to be able to go faster on this hike. Maybe I'll do a couple of personal training sessions. I think that's better. So fun, N of 1, and make it's a regular. I interviewed Dr. Ian Dinnican for Moving to Live. He's a sleep researcher, an Irishman who's living in Australia.
Oh.
And one of his comments was, he said, for me, it's a non-negotiable. Most days of the week, I move an hour a day. He said, I don't care how I may run, I may walk, I may do calisthenics in my hotel room. But for me, it's non-negotiable, not physical, but mental.
Absolutely.
So I think that is, as I've said, so I guess the three things, you're an N of one, pick things, multiple things that you enjoy in a variety of ways, and make it, this is what I do most days of the week. I mean, you probably brushed your teeth when you got up this morning.
Yep.
Now, depending if you're doing intermittent fasting or not, but you're probably going to eat at least one meal a day.
Yes.
Like if you regularly eat lunch, you probably don't regularly eat lunch. So figure out, what can I do to move? One of the things I know, when my dad worked in an office, people would always say, well, let's get together and let's have a lunch meeting. And he was at this time working an hourly job where he got an hour for lunch. He said, no, that hour is my time. I'll meet before lunch. I'll meet after lunch. I'll go with you after lunch and sit there. And what he would do is he would eat his lunch in his car and read for a half hour, and he would walk for a half hour.
Nice.
So, he didn't have to worry about rushing to get his workout or his walking in the morning. If he got home, he spent time with my mom and us, usually probably throwing a wiffle ball at me to try to hit, or throwing a baseball around, or doing something with my sister and me. But I think that's what people do. Too often people say, go, I have to do a yoga class and I have to make it to this 6 a.m. yoga class. Well, you may not be a morning person.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the great things is, if yoga is so important to you, and I'm just throwing yoga as fill in whatever your activity is, there are now, I think this is one of the things that's so wonderful. There are so many wonderful online classes. And if you're not sure what to do, ask somebody, ask somebody like you who's doing this. So you open that up. And if you love the community of going to a yoga class, if you say, okay, I know I can make it most Saturday mornings. If I'm working a job, there's no way I can make it during the week. You take that Saturday morning class and you do 10 minutes every day the rest of the week, or most days the rest of the week. Good friend of mine that I met when I was in grad school, one of his non-negotiables, and I'm jealous of him of this. It's like my longest streak of anything right now, I'm at about 1,700 and some odd straight days of having at least one shot of espresso.
Oh.
So it wasn't planned that way. I hit 1,000. I just kind of went. And I mean, the reason I know that is I remember having a major problem with my eye. And I knew it was bad and I needed to get to the emergency room because I woke up that morning and I didn't want a shot of espresso. But he's almost 2 years in of doing 15 to 20 minutes of some sort of stretching or mobility work every day. And he and his wife just got back from a 32-day road trip with their camper going all around the United States. And he said, I'm glad to be home because I can go into my home gym and stretch, because it's a little crowded if it was raining and I was doing it in the camper. And I don't really like doing it on a picnic table because I'm afraid I'm going to fall off. So I guess to summarize the excess wordiness, you're an N of one.
Yep.
Pick a variety of activities that you do and think about doing them most days of the week. And then finally, don't take yourself seriously. Have fun with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was just such a pleasure to kind of get this mindset perspective shift. I mean, it's something that I guess I believe at some level anyway, but I'd never had the words to really articulate or think about it in this way. So I love it. So Ben, where can people find you online and learn more about what you do?
The easiest way to do it, because everybody has so much social media, but if you go to Instagram and type in at FITLABPGH, at FitLabPGH, that'll pull that up. That'll have our movement tip lifestyle hacks. Whenever we release podcasts, it has that. Or if you type into Google or any other search engine, Fitness Lab Pittsburgh, what will happen is about the first 3 straight pages, and this is what you get when you do videos, about the first 3 pages are going to be various links. But I think the best way is, this is where social media is good. If you just go at FitLab Pittsburgh, and you'll see every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, about 6:30 or so a.m. Eastern time, there'll be a movement tip lifestyle hack video. We've actually just started, as of last week, in addition to our podcast, every Thursday at some point on the day, and this will be on our webpage, but it'll be a link in our Instagram, we're doing education from a lab. So every Thursday, our labs are going to give us a written tip. So if you don't want to move, or you don't understand why movement is important because a human is telling you, a Labrador is going to give you a variety of reasons, probably with occasional guest lectures or guest visits from a cat. But again, the whole thing is, have fun about not taking yourself too seriously. And at the end of the day, treat movement as a lifestyle, something you want to do, something you enjoy doing, And there's literally so many types of movement rather than something you have to do.
Excellent. I love it. Great. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. I always love talking about movement.
Please drop me a line and let me know what you thought of this week's episode. You can email me at holly@hollywharton.com or find me online and get in touch there. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out these related episodes. 390, where I talk about what to do when you don't feel like having adventures. 386 with Heather Waring, walking for personal development and self-care. 385, where I talk about how your adventures can revolutionize your relationship with your body. 378, I talk about how to balance your hobbies when you're a multi-passionate person. And finally, episode 377, where I talk about how to prioritize your hobbies and adventures. Next week, I will be back with another exciting guest. In the meantime, remember to visit hollywharton.com/432 for the show notes on this episode. Happy trails. Thanks so much for listening to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. You can find more information about today's episode, including links for topics that were discussed, at hollywharton.com. That's HOLLYWORTON.com. If you'd like to connect with other listeners and get support on your journey, I would love for you to join my private community on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.